In this video I will talk about France and the French spirit. There's a presidential election today, and I believe that in order to understand the present, one has to understand the past broadly. So this video will be dedicated to the commentary of the fourth chapter of this book, Racial Realities in Europe by Lothrop Stoddard, which was published in 1924. I will make a chronological and systematic commentary. You can see the structure of the video in the description below. There is the title, the topic which I discuss, the time, so you can find a topic that might interest you. I follow the chronological order of the book. And then I will make, before commenting the book, I will make a broad presentation of the context of the publication of the book. Namely, I will briefly talk about Lothrop Stoddard, the 1920s in America and in the Western world at large, and his method of knowledge. And finally, I will put the structure of the encyclopedia of the philosophical sciences in order to have a broad view of the unfolding of being. So I begin. I will read, I just explained the context. If you're not interested, you can skip directly to the commentary. I explained the context of the publication of the book. This is the foreword published in, written in Brooklyn, Massachusetts by Stoddard in June 1924, officially. The scientific discoveries of the past generation have clearly revealed the vital importance of the racial factor in human affairs. Race, hitherto disregarded or minimized, is now seen to be the basic element in the destinies of peoples. So he was conscious of the scientific evolution that was taking place in the early 20th century after the Darwinian Revolution and the beginning of racial anthropology. This momentous discovery makes necessary a reinterpretation of both history and current events. That does not mean neglecting traditional factors like soil, climate, ideals, and institutions. Soil and climate are natural determinations. Ideals and institutions are determinations of objective spirit, in Hegel's language. It does, however, mean a re-examination of man's past and present in which the racial factor shall be duly recognized and its significance appreciated. Only thus can we attain the wider, clearer vision which our troubled times so urgently need. This is still valid to this day. With the development of the internet and the sharing of information, we are living again an age in which the discoveries of science, or the rediscoveries or the adjustments of science, force us to reconsider and reinterpret past and modern history and current events. Whether one agrees or disagrees with the notion of race, it is part of Western life. And this book attempts a brief survey of Europe along these lines. It makes no pretension to either completeness or finality. It is frankly a pioneering sketch. My hope is that others may be stimulated to enter and explore this largely uncharted field. So that's the context. Lothrop Stoddard could be defined as he was a journalist, an American journalist. He was a Nordic supremacist, as we would call this. So he was advocating the cause of the Nordic race, which was in his view a sub-racial group of the European race. So he was not a strictly speaking white nationalist, or maybe he was, but he was first and foremost a Nordic nationalist, and he was an American Nordic nationalist. So the idea that the racist thinkers of the early 20th century were white nationalists is not completely true, in the sense that their harshest criticism is aimed against the non-Nordic sub-races or sub-genres or sub-species of the white race. So this has to be kept in mind. But one thing has to be acknowledged about Stoddard is that he was a very intelligent man, and his method consists in looking at all the aspects of human life. In this book, he deals about geography, about racial anthropology, about psychology, about economics, sociology, politics, finance, geopolitics, and briefly about culture and history. So he has not a consciously encyclopedic view, but because he was intelligent, he looked at most of the aspects of existence in order to understand a question. And he was a very intelligent man. That's what I could say. So now I will begin the commentary. There are 28 points. I follow the chronological order. The first thing to notice, it's a recurrent feature in European Western literature, the idea to be looked at, to be observed through the eyes of an other, a foreigner, a stranger. This is frequent in European literature. And in this case, France sees herself through the eyes of an American journalist. And he says, France is in many ways a land of paradox. More perhaps than in any other European country, one must get below the surface to understand the true trend of affairs. The first impression which France gives the stranger, in this case the American journalist, is that of intense unity. So, second point. When you come to meet Frenchmen, so we're in the 1920s, this impression of unity is deepened in manners, habits, ordinary conversation. It's prevalent. Above all, they are strongly nationalistic. Frenchmen profess an ardent national patriotism. They are forever talking and writing about it. La France and la patrie, which means the fatherland, are words continually on French lips. Frenchmen emphasize the unity of their country, France, one and indivisible. And I will make a comment about the modern situation in France. When I read this book for the first time many years ago, I was struck because today the opposite is true. In today's France, everyone is against patriotism, nationalism, and against the idea of France. What the French have today, for the past 20 years, it has been developing over decades, but it's becoming more intense over the decades, is an ardent and strong obsession with the idea of the Republic. It is no longer France, not the fatherland, but what they call the Republic. And it is no longer France, which is one and indivisible, but the Republic. And if you are an American or whoever, the Republic in France is nothing to do with the Republicans in America. The Republic is the constitutional structure, which is a constitutional and legislative structure, but also filled with values and ideals. And in France, we call this les valeurs de la République, which means the values of the Republic. And one of them is le vivre ensemble, which translated literally would mean in English the living together. So live together, it's a verb, an adverb, and it's translated into a substantive, into a noun, the living together, or the live together. That's how we say in France. It's the equivalent, the values of the Republic and the vivre ensemble, the living together, it's the French equivalent of probably what in America is diversity is our strength. It's a motto that everyone repeats constantly without thinking whether it's true or not. It's some sort of automatic repetition. And the context, the historical context of the 1920s, after the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, when Napoleon III, which was the second empire for France, lost against Prussia, which enabled the unification of Germany by Bismarck. After the defeat, the second empire in France became a republic, the Third Republic. And one of the fundamental features of the Third Republic in France, its will to eradicate the clergy, the church, basically. So there have been conflicts between the Republicans and the traditional Catholics, and the Republicans won eventually, and they took control over the school system and the educational system. And the main emphasis during the Third Republic, which lasted for I think the longest republic, it's from 1871 until 1940, and during the events of the Second World War, where the Third Republic collapsed eventually and was replaced by the state of the Maréchal Pétain. And yeah, the main feature of the Third Republic is the educational system, free and compulsory education for all. And the Republicans tried to develop a Republican mentality as opposed to a Christian Catholic mentality, and to shape and structure the mind of the pupils, of the youth of the French nation, and to make them patriots. And there has been moments at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century when the school system was used to infuse the youth of France with a feeling of revenge against Germany for the defeat in the Prussian War. And it eventually led, that's not the sole factor, but it contributed to the events which led to the First World War, because the children had been indoctrinated to wish to take a revenge on Germany. So, yeah. Now, third point about centralization. This unitary doctrine that France, in the 1920s, France was one and indivisible, and in today's France, the Republic is one and indivisible. France has disappeared. It's the Republic. This unitary doctrine is reflected in the centralization that characterizes every phase of French national life. Government, finance, education, art, and literature, all are centered in Paris, the mighty capital. So this is a fundamental feature of French history, but it's still prevalent to this day. There is a very strong central government in France, which is socialist, basically. And we call this, we don't, but those who have a broad knowledge of French history call this the opposition between the Jacobin, and the Girondins, which was the opposition during the French Revolution between, to simplify to the utmost, I simplify, it's more complicated than that, but the Jacobins were the leftists, and the Girondins were the moderate center-right, so to speak. And if I had to translate this in universal terms, I would say that the Jacobins are centralized statists, and the Girondins are federalists. They want more autonomy for the regions, a decentralized government. That's how I could express this. This is the particularity of the French history, French culture, and French country, but this opposition between a central government and a federal state, a freedom for and self-determination and autonomy for the regions, or central planned government in the capital, it's a fundamental feature of every country in which there is a state. There is this opposition, this tendency between centralization and autonomy. And because of the history of the French Revolution, which was attempted to impose a centralized Jacobin government, and because before the French Revolution, the kings throughout history had attempted to impose a centralized monarchy, most notably under Louis XIV, who wanted to control everything, not in the bureaucratic sense, but he wanted to be the king and the ruler, an absolute monarch. Yeah, so This is a fundamental feature of France, which was true in the 1920s, and it is still true to this day. Okay. Fourth point. He asks himself, from a racial anthropological perspective, one might think that the French in the 1920s, 98% at least of the French population was French European white. One may think of the French as a homogeneous people, but is it really so? It's very far from being the case. The truth of the matter is that the French are a nation, not a race. A nation is a spiritual determination. It depends on the realm of objective spirit. In the Encyclopedia of Hegel, it's a matter of institutions, politics, citizenship, notably patriotism and so on, and cultural values. So it's a mixture of objective and absolute spirit in Hegel's Encyclopedia. And race is a determination of subjective spirit. So in his view, the French are a nation, but not a race. And this is very important to understand this distinction within the French mind between the idea of the nation, which is a non-ethnic, non-racial idea in the French perspective, and the idea of race or ethnicity in a biological sense. And the two are opposed, and they have been shaping French history for the past 200 years and world history because of the influence of French ideas. So it's very important to understand modern France and the modern world to understand this distinction. France is in fact a good example of national as distinguished from racial unity. That French unity lacks the racial element, although all French in the 1920s, or 98 or 99% of the French were white European Frenchmen. They were different sub-racial, sub-specific groups. They were subspecies of the European race, as they call this. But this is why he means that there is no racial unity, because there are particular sub-racial types. This lack the French instinctively feel to be a weakness and a possible source of danger to their national life. This is a universal truth in every multiracial, multi-ethnic country almost. There is a sense of weakness and a possible source of danger and conflict, and people of different races or ethnicities and religions can live together peacefully and in harmony, but in the majority of cases throughout the world, it's a source of conflict and tension. This is just the reason why they are always stressing their unity and why they favor extreme centralization. So, according to him, there is a logical connection between the fear or the doubt about the unity from an anthropological standpoint, and this lack of trust in one another creates the need for strong political and therefore eventually economic centralization and eventually domination of the state. So there's this idea. It can explain France to this day, because France today is even more diverse anthropologically, because it's a multi-ethnic country today, and there is still this strong will to centralize everything and to rely upon the state to bring unification and to solve all the problems, because the French instinctively feel that there are eventually that their diversity might be a source of weakness. So it is still true today. Okay. Now he talks about the various ethnic or racial groups that he identifies in 1920s France. He compares France with England. Both are strongly marked nations. The difference in his view, which I'm not sure is correct, that England has racial unity, whereas France has not. The English are overwhelmingly Nordic, in his view, and the French is made up of all the free European races which were distinguished by the anthropologist of this era, namely Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean. To simplify, the Nordic are the Nordic Europeans, Alpine are Central Europeans, in the middle of Europe from a north-south perspective, those in the middle, and Mediterraneans are southern Europeans. But today's anthropologists notice that there are the Slavs, the Dinaric people, the Basque, who are a specific group, the Finns are partly distinguished, and the Irish are partly different, so it's more complex. But the distinction of his time and science is a process which functions by errors and correcting the errors, and it's not because a scientific theory, which is not even a scientific theory, it's a vulgarization, it's a simplification, but it's not because a scientific theory was wrong at any given time that it should be totally condemned, because being wrong and correcting one's error is part of the scientific process, and the entire history of science is made of the errors of great minds, and it's only by accumulating errors that one finally arrived at the truth. So it's a self-correcting process. And there are DNA data at the end of the book, modern DNA data from 2012, and it seemed to indicate that the difference between the white English and the white French, although the English are more Nordic, the difference are not so strong. So maybe he was wrong. Maybe he was deluded by his pro-Nordic perspective. I don't know. Then he talks about briefly about the history of England and France. He says that, and he's partly right, that French history and nationality, the idea of nationality in France has been shaped by the factors of history, foreign invasion, and a conscious effort of the French ruling class, first aristocratic and the king, the various kings, and then during the revolution and during the Restoration and the Empire and the Second Empire and the Third Republic, a conscious attempt to unify from above the country into a political unity. So it's not from the bottom up, it's not the people who created the state, as in some other countries. It is the state which did not create the people, but it is the state which shaped the people. That's a fundamental structure of French history. The idea that the unity comes from above, whereas in other examples, mostly in Eastern Europe, it is the people which expresses the will to form a nation and eventually a state. In France, it's the opposite, and that's very important to understand French history. Okay, now about the idea of nationalism. It's fundamental to understand today's world. He says, in France, however, national unity was attained only after great difficulties, so that in France, nationality, which is not racial in the French perspective, it's not racial, not ethnic, it's civic, cultural, political. In France, nationality became a conscious principle, inspiring passionate zeal of an almost religious character. It was revolutionary France, at the end of the 18th century, that proclaimed the doctrine of nationality. So the French invented modern nationalism, which asserts that national feeling is more powerful than blood in binding men together. This idea comes from France. It may have been expressed differently at earlier date, but the modern version of nationalism, the idea that nationalism is in the positive sense. Today, nationalism has a very negative connotation, but we could replace this by patriotism. The idea that it is through citizenship, through education, through belonging to a civic and political community, and through culture that you acquire a nationality, so that any person, independently of his race or origin, can become a member of the national community. This idea was mostly developed and spread by France during the Revolution, and this collides with the more Germanic idea of the nation, which is united by blood. This is the classical Germanic view. And here we have a conflict of ideology, which provoked many wars, and which is still the source of conflict throughout the world. Is nation an idea, or is it in your blood? That's relevant to understand today's intellectual life in the West. These are the kind of debates that the alt-right and the alt-right still have today. He continues, this doctrine of nationalism differentiated from blood has profoundly affected the thought not merely of France, but of the whole world, and is still widely believed. And 100 years later, it's still true. However, that's very important. However, the discoveries of modern science are undermining its authority. We now know that nationality is at bottom merely a state of mind, which may conceal but cannot really abolish those profound differences of instinct, temperament, and intelligence that are inborn in persons of different racial stocks. So this kind of question that, or perspective that officially dates from 1924, these are the kind of debates that the alt-right has today in the white nationalist circles. And there is a conflict between politics and the development of science, which is an epistemological evolution. And so there's a connection between science and politics, and they mutually and reciprocally influence one another. So if one wants to understand the world, one has to understand this reciprocal process of mutual influence. And also, it is a conflict between biology and mind. Is the mind influenced by biology? Do we think the way we do because of our anthropological determinations? Or can the mind become totally independent from the body in which it resides, so to speak? These are philosophical questions of the highest importance. Is there an American character, an English character, a French character, and can you adopt this character only if you have an American anthropological determination, English, French, German, etc.? These questions are still unanswered. Yeah. Now I will talk about eighth point. He talks about the inhabitants of France in the 1920s. In spite of the fact that for generations everything has been done to break down local distinctions and to unify her population, the inhabitants of various parts of France differ from one another in many important ways. And he quotes Gustave Le Bon, a French author. In France, the Provençal is very different from the Breton, the inhabitant of Auvergne from the inhabitant of Normandy. So these are the various regions of France. It's difficult in consequence to devise institutions which shall suit them all equally well, and it is only by dint of energetic concentration that it is possible to lend them some community of thought. There's this idea that it's political action that must equalize the various mindsets. Our profound divergences of sentiment and belief and the political upheavals which result therefrom are due in the main to differences of mental constitution. So that's a logical question, because this is the conflict between the universal and the particular. I don't know how people imagine the French, I mean the white French, to be, or how they were a few decades ago or a century ago. But the idea that there is a typical Frenchman is kind of delusional, because every region in France historically has had its own particular type of Frenchman, and the Frenchman, which would be the universal, does not exist independently of all its particular embodiments. There are at least a dozen. Officially, there are more than 20 regions, but I'm not talking about the administrative region. I'm talking about the cultural region. There are at least a dozen different regions in France with historically particular type of Frenchmen, with a particular culture, sometimes a particular language, a particular way of dressing, a particular type of food, a particular type of architecture, stories, songs, with a particular culture. And the Frenchman, as he's caricatured from the outside, the guys from Paris with a beret on his head and a baguette, a bread, and drinking wine and eating cheese and drinking champagne. That's maybe the idea. That would be the Parisian Frenchman, but it's just a particular. And the universal, which means the Frenchman, does not exist independently of all its particular embodiments. So that's a logical determinations. Each French region historically has been a particular type of the universality, which is Frenchhood or Frenchness. And that's a logical determination. And what the educational system under the Third Republic between broadly 1871 and 1940 has attempted to do is to erase these oppositions, because in a logical standpoint, the realm of the particular is the realm of opposition. The particular are opposed to one another. So the state and the educational system and the Republic has tried to erase these oppositions by mingling and mixing culturally the people through a common national culture, national education, the imposition of the French national language, which was not the official language of all the French. There were particular languages and dialects. So this attempt to erase the particular in order to produce a universal type, it has been attempted in the realm of education and culture by France at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And in the second half of the 20th century, it has been attempted and still being attempted to this day by mingling and mixing racially the people to erase the racial differences by creating a mixed race population. So this is still in process. It's a logical attempt to solve the problem, the contradiction between the universal and the particular. First through education, and today through genetic engineering, so to speak. Yeah. Then, point 9, he talks about this will to unify and to centralize creates its own opposite, which is a demand for granting local self-government and encouraging intellectual life in the provinces instead of draining all the intellectual life to Paris. And this is what we could call federalism, a will to have more freedom, more autonomy, more independence for the various regions, and to balance the intellectual power and economic and political power. And this conflict is universal in every developed country with a state. There is this shift between centralization and federalism. And yeah. Now, the question of the French, their view of race in the context of the 1920s. So the white Frenchmen, how do they think about race? He says that the French, in his view, dislike to admit the importance of race in human affairs. Most Frenchmen cling to the old doctrine of nationality, namely non-racial, non-ethnic nationalism, so patriotic, civic nationalism, and even deny that racial differences amount to much. Leading French students of race say that their writings are not only unpopular, but have been condemned as downright unpatriotic in official circles. This reveals a state of mind in the French people which is of unquestionable importance to the world at large. France's insistence upon nationalism and minimizing of race, though due primarily to her internal political situation, the fact that there are various ethnic groups of white Europeans within France, affects strongly her attitude toward her vast colonial empire in Africa, most notably. So, in a country which historically in the 1920s was 98% white, racial science was condemned as unpatriotic by whites. It was not some scheming by another ethnic group. It was partly that also, but it was whites who rejected racial science not to protect the minorities, which were 1 or 2% of the population, but to preserve what they thought was a political unity which might be divided if people started to think in terms of race. So this idea is still dominant in the left all over the Western world. And I don't know if it was born in France, but it was prevalent and very important in France. And France, a century ago, was very influential culturally. It was today, France is a lot less influential, but a century ago, and I will talk about this later, it was the first military power in the world. At the end of the First World War, France was the most powerful army in the world, more than the US. It's only later that the US became much more powerful, but it was a political, military, colonial, cultural influence. So, yeah. And, I noted, of course, that these views on race, this book was officially published in 1924 when another book was being written in the same time, namely Mein Kampf by Hitler. And these ideas, Hitler probably never read Stoddard, but these ideas were widespread in the far right circles, and Hitler accused France of having these ideas. And one cannot understand the development of Hitler without understanding French ideas and the French view of nationalism, and how the Germanic eventually view of nationalism opposed directly and confronted the French view, and how Hitler was influenced by these kind of ideas. So, yeah. Eleven point about racial segregation. He says that the three races, Alpine, Nordic, Mediterranean, which are sub-races of the European race in the view of these anthropologists of the early 20th century. So the three races which make up France's population are largely segregated in different regions. The reason for this is found in the geography of the country. Race lines have in fact always tended to follow geographic lines. So I will not dwell upon this very long, but there's this idea that in order to understand anthropology, one has to understand geography, which is a natural physical determination, which is the sphere of nature. Anthropology is the sphere of subjective spirit, and the whole attempt of Stoddard is to show that subjective spirit, namely race, influences objective spirit. So all are connected, and one cannot understand history without understanding geography and without understanding physics eventually. Okay, 12 point. Here, that's the Nordic supremacist talking. He says that there has been a balance of power from one racial element to another in France. And he defines the Alpine as hardworking, thrifty, clinging to the soil, caring little for politics, and contributing little to either art or ideas. The French Alpine has been the typical peasant, the man with the hoe, accepting stolidly the rule of more active and intelligent stocks. So here that's borderline racism. That's the view of a Nordic supremacist who thinks that all English and all white Americans, or most of them, are Nordic Europeans, and he has a kind of downgraded view of what he calls the Alpine. So he's not really being completely fair. Yeah. Okay, 13th point. Then he talks about the Nordic. He talks about the Nordic barbarian invasions coming from Germany at the end of the Roman Empire, and the Franks, who gave their name to France, were a Germanic Nordic tribe. And he says that the north of France, the northern part of France, was once was stocked and populated with a Nordic population. So, in his view, the northern part of France was, and still is partly, Nordic. For 1,000 years, France was a predominantly Nordic land. The ruling classes were everywhere mainly Nordic in blood and set the tone to French life. The French spirit in the Middle Ages was a spirit of individualistic energy, a fierce self-assertiveness, and a richness of local life which are rare in the centralized, regulated France of today. So these are the spiritual and psychological views that he associates, rightly or wrongly, with what he calls the Nordic race. And and he says that the reason for the decline of the Nordic was the endless series of wars, foreign, civil, and religious, which devastated the country. And this is a common theme in the writings of the white supremacist or nationalists, who says that the Nordic race has always been the cause of its own problems by constantly fighting against one another. Yeah. Then he talks about the French Revolution, and he has an anthropological view of the French Revolution. In his view, it was largely a revolt of the Alpine and the Mediterranean elements against the Nordic ruling class. The revolutionary leaders openly boasted that they were avenging themselves on the descendants of the Nordic Franks. And he says that the revolution marks a turning point in the racial history of France. So here his view might be simplified. The idea was that the ruling aristocracy was Nordic, and the third estate was Alpine and Mediterranean, and they revolted against the ruling class. That's a simplified view, but it's a view which deserves to be taken into account, because in the French historiography of the French Revolution, there are mainly two views. The Marxist view, that the French Revolution was a class conflict, and the Christian view says that these were a revolt of atheists against traditional Christian views. So there are the Catholics who are nostalgic of the pre-Christian Ancien Régime, and the Marxists who saw the revolution as the triumph of the bourgeoisie and a moment in the process of the development of the revolution of the proletariat, which would come eventually. So the idea that there is an anthropological element, that there might be an anthropological element, is completely taboo in France. It's not that it's even taboo, it's that no one even thinks about this. It's so far removed from French thought that only an American, I guess, could think about such a view. Okay, he says that today, so in the 1920s, the majority of the French population is Alpine, and in his view, the Nordics contribute most to science and invention, while in art and literature, the honors are shared between Nordics and Mediterraneans. The general tone of French national life is becoming increasingly Alpine in character. So he acknowledges that the Alpine, in his view, which is kind of racist because you classify, you categorize, you simplify. In his view, the Alpine is hardworking, thrifty, solid, but limited in imaginative vision and creative intelligence. The modern political and economic conditions have brought the Alpine to power, and the peasant are the most numerous occupational group in the nation, and he seems to identify the peasant with the Alpine. And historically, France has always been a nation of peasants and farmers and agriculturists. Yeah. So, just to conclude that in the view of Stoddard's, geography, anthropology, economics, politics, sociology, finance, art, psychology, everything is interconnected. So he was not a Hegelian, strictly speaking, but in a way he was, because he had this totalitarian, not totalitarian, but totalistic, holistic view of the question that he was investigating. He tried to have a broad view, and this is the reason why he was such an intelligent man, is because he had a broad and wide and encompassing perspective. So now he talks about economics, and that's relevant to understand European and world economics. France never industrialized herself like England and Germany. In the 39 million inhabitants in the 1920s, officially, 21 millions live on the land. So more than half the population was rural or agricultural in a way, not farmers, but living apart from cities and big cities. France is kind of self-reliant in the sense that it does not depend for her very life upon selling the products of her industry to foreign markets, whereas England or Britain and Germany, who are more industrially developed, rely upon the principle of mass production for foreign markets, whereas France has a limited production in the 1920s and a high tariff wall for the home market. The French hates to scrap anything, so that's a good habit, I guess. And France shines in exports in which France is highly specialized, in his view, like ladies' fashions, silks, perfumes, wines, and other articles of luxury and high quality. So there was already the glimpse, but it was the main economic feature of the time, British economic imperialism and German economic imperialism. It was the dominant feature from an economic standpoint of the 1920s, with of course the rise of America, also the development of America. So these highly industrialized nations were in conflict with one another to grasp the markets. And Hitler talks about this in Mein Kampf. He says that Germany wanted to peacefully conquer the world through commerce and business, and eventually the will of the Germans collided and clashed with the dominance of Britain. And yeah. Then he talks briefly about finance. That in his view, French business and finance have the same character as French industry. They prefer safety to chances of big profits and risks of big losses. So they are kind of moderate in finance, in his view. Now, he talks about the situation of France after the First World War, refraining from thoroughly industrializing herself like England and Germany, maintaining a balance between town and country with a stationary population. France led a stable, well-balanced existence. So there was a relatively well-balanced life between the agricultural farming aspect, industry and craftsmanship, and the more developed intellectual professions, but it was still a relatively rural country, so to speak. It was a modern country, of course, but a relatively ancient country in comparison with America, England, and Germany. And after the war, he says, France is much weaker in blood and wealth, but much stronger in political and military power. After the First World War, France became the dominant military power in Europe and in the world eventually, for a brief moment, and the political leader, the dominant political leader in Europe. it has to be. And Europe was completely dominant. The United States had not yet risen to world domination, so France dominated the dominant continent of the world in the 1920s. Then he talks about demographics. The problem of France from a demographic perspective was already 100 years ago that the population has long been practically stationary. France historically is one of the first countries, if not the first country, where the birth rates became stable and population ceased to grow because the mortality rates dropped and the birth rates declined as well. So France has had for a long time a problem of demographics, whereas in Germany the birth rates started to continue to rise, and this explains also German imperialism and Hitler's view is that the Lebensraum, it's a demographic problem also. And then he talks about immigration with the growing number of foreigners who had entered the country. In 1861, there were apparently 400,000 foreigners, mostly overwhelmingly European. In 1921, it was 1,600,000 for a population of broadly 40 million, so it's 5% broadly. Nearly 1/3 of these are Italians, with Belgians and Spaniards also contributing large quotas. So the question of immigration in France, it started at the very end of the 19th century and in the early moments of the 20th century. But the immigrants were mostly Italians or Belgians or Polish or Spaniards or Portuguese even. No, the Portuguese not at this moment. It was mostly Italians, Spaniards, Belgians and Poles. And they were all white European Catholics except for the Poles, of Latin culture. So they were white, they were Europeans, they were Catholic, and they were Latin in culture. And he says that some Frenchmen saw this as a possible danger to French national and cultural unity. So I know that he himself, Stoddard, saw the same problem with non-Nordic whites coming to America, Eastern Europeans and Mediterraneans, Italians and so on and so forth, and the Irish probably. So he had, in his view, the same problem with white non-Nordic immigrants and non-white immigrants. And here was the same source of doubt and fear for the French. And to relate to the situation in France today, since the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of immigrants have been non-Europeans, Northern Africans, Turks, Sub-Saharan Africans, Asians, etc. And there's this idea in today's France that an immigrant is an immigrant. Immigration worked in the past, so if an immigrant is an immigrant, immigration should work in the present. And here again we find logical problems, because immigrant in this case is the universality, but the universal particularizes itself. A white Catholic European Italian immigrant is a particular type of immigrant, and a sub-Saharan Muslim person from Senegal is another particular type of immigrant, and the particular are at conflict with one another. So the question of immigration is problematic in today's France, and it is debated and not debated. It's a taboo subject, but everyone thinks or talks about this because they feel that it might be a threat and a danger to French national and cultural unity. but they do not dare speak in terms of anthropology. They speak in terms of culture, religion, etc., etc. That's the main topic of French political life, and has been for the past 20 or 30 years, but it's a topic that no one talks about, but at the same time everyone talks about. Everyone talks about the need not to talk about this topic. So it's an obsession. So, yeah. He talks about finance and money and how the franc, the French money of the time, fell. So he has a paragraph about finance and money. It's connected to the rest, so it's not the most interesting and relevant part, but he mentions this. Point 21, the situation of France after the war. France won the war, and the peace treaties gave her such political and military power that she stands today the strongest nation on the European continent. Her army is the finest war machine in existence, while the system of alliances that she has built up, stretching from Belgium to Poland, dominates the continent, at least for the time being. And also, France has a great colonial empire, second only to Britain. Yeah. So he understood geopolitics very well, and Hitler resented this situation and the dominance of France, and one cannot understand European history in the 1920s and 30s and the Second World War without understanding all these aspects. So, yeah. Then he talks about the path which France was confronted with, choosing the right path. There was the path of conservative foreign policy and domestic reconstruction along traditional lines, or the path of expansive policy, both foreign and domestic. And the conservative path along traditional lines is the path that the Maréchal Pétain, after the military defeat in 1940 against National Socialist Germany, chose the restoration of a traditional patriotic, Catholic, reactionary regime. And it is considered by many today, by almost everyone except some radical right-wing Catholics, as being the worst moment in French history. So, yeah. Point 23. Here I will briefly mention the economic and geopolitical situation. He understood that, he says that if France abandons her economic system, which is still relatively rural, so to speak, for that of mass production of industrial staples for the world market, she will have to do precisely what England did a century ago, so at the beginning of the 19th century, and what Germany did half a century ago. So broadly, with the unification of the Second Reich under Bismarck. So here he understood that it's almost a Marxist analysis. That's why Stoddard was intelligent. He was not a dumb racist. He was a complete intellectual. He had views on all the fields of human activity, and his view is partly Marxist. So the Marxists are partly right in their analysis of imperialism and economic will to domination, which creates conflicts. And there had to be a conflict between England and Germany because Germany wanted to assert herself or itself, assert herself in the economic competition. And this gave rise to the First and Second World War for Germany. And he talks about, so we're in 1924 officially, about rising industrial nations like Italy and Japan and Germany if she recovers her former industrial strength. So the alliance, the acts between the unity between Italy, Japan, and Germany were rising industrial nations. So when the Marxists have a purely, strictly economic view of geopolitics, they are partly right, but they miss the full picture. He talks about the French mood. He says that the French that he's had the opportunity to talk with has contrasting ideas and sentiments, often held by the same individual. He says, I have heard a Frenchman start a conversation with expressions of high confidence in France's position and prospects, and a few minutes late fall into deep pessimism. This is the result of the unusual combination of strength and weakness. Yeah. 25th point, he talks about the Colonial Empire. France was the second largest colonial empire in the world, and he distinguishes the British Empire and the French Empire. It's a colonial empire. France was a republic, but it was a colonial empire. The British colonies are rapidly evolving into a loose-knit association of semi-independent nations. So he understood this very well. The French, however, the French colonial empire is an old-fashioned one where the colonies are closely subordinated to the home government and surrounded by a high tariff wall, which makes them frankly a preserve for French trade and commerce. And he says that the English colonies, some of them, are populated by British colonials. I guess he refers to Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. But none of the French colonies contain large populations of French, except Algeria, where there were 500,000 white Frenchmen living there, and there was the war in Algeria in the 1960s, and the French were excluded and repelled eventually, and they had to go back to France, where they were not accepted by the French local population, although they were white Frenchmen. For a long time, France regarded her colonial possession chiefly in an economic sense, and it has been shown by modern studies that the colonial empire cost more money to France than it gave, France gained from having a colonial empire. So it was, from a strictly economic standpoint, it was a waste of money and time. This is the idea that is being developed by some French scholars. The idea was that the colonies would absorb France's exports and capital while furnishing France in return with the bulk of their imported raw materials and tropical products. But about a generation ago, he says, France woke up to the potential value of her colonies in the political and military sense. In the First World War, soldiers from Africa and Asia were shipped to Europe by France. And the view of the French was to use this manpower, this colonial manpower, in the French military. And he quotes a French general, "Our colonial empire may be welded into one whole with France herself, and our power of expansion in the whole world thus increased." He says that France was no longer a nation of 40 million, but a nation of 100 million. So the idea was that all the individuals living in the French colonial empire were potentially Frenchmen, whatever their origin. So this idea played a tremendous role on French history, European history, and world history eventually. And I continue 26th point. He continues about commenting this. France avowed an intention of exploiting her colored colonial mind power for use in Europe is rousing fear and antagonism in Europe. Prominent Englishmen and Italians have assured me that neither country would long tolerate a policy which they considered a menace to the very heart of European civilization. These ideas were developed by Hitler. Hitler and the National Socialist intellectuals resented France because of her anti-racist policy. There was a strong resentment from the Germans against the French because of France's politics regarding her colonial empire. So it must be understood, and Stoddard understood this very well before Hitler. And yeah. And now I will talk about the French view of their past. He says that France in the 1920s was like in the same position as it was at the height of Napoleon's power, outwardly brilliant, inwardly dangerous. And he says that he talks about the danger or the delusion of fantasizing or idealizing the past. And he says that many Frenchmen look at the past, look at themselves as their country was in the past, so they are misled by the former glory. And he says that the Germans are guilty of the same delusion, which would prove tragic, because the Germans had a view of their past which gave them the impulse to the will to reestablish a glorious presence and a glorious present and a glorious future, and this gave birth to National Socialism. And he says that in the days of her greatest power, in the 17th century under Louis XIV and Napoleon, in those days France was in every respect the strongest nation in Europe. Under Louis XIV, so second half of 17th century and beginning of 18th century, France had 3 times the population of Britain, twice the population of Germany, and almost twice the population of Russia. So France was a demographic superpower. It was described sometimes as the China of Europe. And some French are nostalgic of these eras where France was the dominant power of the dominant continent in the world. This view of an idealized past has tremendous influences upon the present. Make America great again is the typical view of an idealized past, which has very strong consequences in the present, because when you create the view of a greatness which has been lost, you give the impulse and the will to recreate this greatness, and this can bring about difficult consequences. But yeah. And I conclude with the 20th point, the last point. He says that he just recapitulates, he just summarizes what he's been saying all along the chapter, namely that there has been a demographic change within the white French population, and this will have, in his view, influences upon politics, culture, economics, and French history eventually. So, to conclude, Stoddard was very intelligent, and he he had a full view of history, because he looked at all the aspects, geographic, anthropological aspects, racial aspects, psychological aspects, economics, sociology, politics, legislation, of course, history, geopolitics, culture. He was a very intelligent man, and the epistemological and scientific revolution that he was witnessing is the same that we are witnessing today. That's why we can understand the present by studying the past, because we are living the same changes in our day and age. And the debates and the problems and the conflicts of his times are the debates, the problems, and the conflicts of our time. That's what I could say. So why bother talk about 1920s France? It's because the situation in the 1920s explains the situation and the mindset of France today, and how the French think and act and behave today, and the whole history of France and Germany and England and Europe and world history eventually. So it's the middle of the night. I will go to sleep. If I have the possibility, and when I wake up, I will make another video about the French spirit, to try to understand the French election, and to understand France, and which is a particular country in the development of world spirit. So that's what I had to say.